First of all, what's your assessment of how many Russian soldiers have thus far been killed and how many injured? And based on your experience with Putin, what would it take to change Putin's calculus in Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think Putin is determined to dominate and control Ukraine, to shape its orientation. This is a matter of deep personal conviction for him. He's been stewing in a combustible combination of grievance and ambition for many years. That personal conviction matters more than ever in the Russian system. He's created a system in which his own circle of advisors is narrower and narrower. COVID has made that even narrower. And it's a system in which it's not proven career enhancing for people to question or challenge his judgment. So he's gone to war, I think, on the basis, Mr. Chairman, of a number of assumptions which led him to believe that Russia faced a favorable landscape for the use of force against Ukraine this winter. First, that Ukraine, in his view, was weak and easily intimidated. Second, that the Europeans, especially the French and Germans, were distracted by elections in France and a leadership succession in Germany and risk averse. Third, he believed he had sanctions-proofed his economy in the sense of creating a large war chest of foreign currency reserves. And fourth, he was confident that he had modernized his military and they were capable of a quick, decisive victory at minimal cost. He's been proven wrong on every count. Those assumptions have proven to be profoundly flawed over the last 12 days of conflict. President Zelensky, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, as the ranking member mentioned, has risen to the moment and demonstrated courageous and remarkable leadership, and Ukrainians have resisted fiercely. Second, the Europeans have demonstrated remarkable resolve, especially the Germans. Third, the economic consequences of the sanctions which have been enacted so far are proven to be devastating for Russia, especially against the Russian central bank, depriving Putin of the ability that he assumed he'd have to defend the ruble. And fourth, his own military's performance has been largely ineffective. Instead of seizing Kiev within the first 2 days of the campaign, which was what his plan was premised upon, after nearly 2 weeks, they still have not been able to fully encircle the city. And so, Putin has commented privately and publicly over the years that he doesn't believe Ukraine's a real country. He's dead wrong about that. Real countries fight back. And that's what the Ukrainians have done quite heroically over the last 12 days. As you said, Mr. Chairman, I think Putin is angry and frustrated right now. He's likely to double down and try to grind down the Ukrainian military with no regard for civilian casualties. But the challenge that he faces, and this is the biggest question that's hung over our analysis of his planning for months now, as Director Haynes said, is he has no sustainable political endgame in the face of what is going to continue to be fierce resistance from Ukrainians. So I think that's what his calculus has been, and I think that's the reality of what he faces today. In terms of casualties, I know General Barry may want to comment on that, but there have been far in excess Russian military casualties killed and wounded, far in excess of what he anticipated. Because his military planning and assumptions was premised on a quick, decisive victory, and that has not proven to be the case.
Director Barry, are you able to comment on that? And also, this massive column heading toward Kyiv, now maybe two massive columns, public reports suggest that they've run out of fuel. Are we learning that the Russian military is far less competent than we imagined? How do you assess their performance thus far?
Chairman, I think the Russian army reformed into this thing we call the New Look Army. And they task organize themselves into smaller battalion tactical groups, and fundamentally that is not a bad construct. I think they had a bad plan, and I think their logistics support is not what it needs to be to develop the situation that they wanted to do. And we can go into much more detail on that in the closed session.
Are you able to say in open session how many Russian troops have been killed?
With low confidence, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000. That number comes from some intelligence sources, but also open source and how we pull that together.
Director Burns, whatever Putin's plan may have been on the way in, if that plan involved the installation of a puppet regime, that seems highly implausible now. How does this end?
Well, that's the core question, Mr. Chairman. I think Putin's assumptions, as I said before, have turned out to be profoundly flawed. I failed to see, and our analysts failed to see, how he could sustain a puppet regime or a pro-Russian leadership that he tries to install in the face of what is massive opposition from the Ukrainian people. In many ways, it's been Putin's aggression going back to 2014 in Crimea that's created the strong sense of Ukrainian nationhood and sovereignty that he faces today. So I fail to see how he can produce that kind of an endgame. And where that leads, I think, is for an ugly next few weeks in which he doubles down, as I said before, with scant regard for civilian casualties, in which urban fighting can get even uglier. Because the one thing I'm absolutely convinced of, and I think our analysts across the intelligence community are absolutely convinced of, is the Ukrainians are going to continue to resist fiercely and effectively.
I want to associate myself with Mr. Fitzpatrick's comments. I believe that the American people think we need to do more. And to call this unprovoked is actually modest. It is premeditated. It is savage. It is unconscionable brutality. And we're going to watch a genocide happen in Ukraine if we don't create our own red lines. So I guess I'd like to start with you, Director Burns, because you know Vladimir Putin better than probably anyone else in this room. He's already said he has a red line, which is the economic sanctions. That was, the beginning of World War III. He clearly wants to recreate the Soviet Union and pick up all the Balkan states. Why are we somehow reluctant to recognize that he's willing to go as far as he needs to go?
Well, Congresswoman, I think Putin's actions, especially in the last 2 weeks, and they have been premeditated and they have been savage, just as you described, I think should remove any doubt about the depth of his determination, not just with regard to Ukraine, but in terms of how he exercises Russian power. I would, however, say that what he's been met with since then, first and foremost by Ukrainians themselves and their courage and their heroism and the strength of their leadership, has surprised and unsettled him. I think he's been unsettled by the Western reaction and Allied resolve, particularly some of the decisions the German government has taken. I think he's been unsettled by the performance of his own military.
I guess, excuse me for interrupting,
Sure.
but do you, knowing as much as you know about him, he's not going to stop at Ukraine, correct?
Well, I think that's what makes it more important than ever to demonstrate that he's not going to succeed in Ukraine. And I think that's what the challenge is for all of us, because what's at stake is more, as important as Ukraine's sovereignty is, what's at stake is more than that. It's about an incredibly important rule in international order that big countries don't get to swallow up small countries just because they can. And I think this is one of those pivotal points where we and all of our allies and partners need to act on that, and I think that's what we're doing.
In 2019, Director Coates said that Russia and China were more aligned than at any point since the mid-1950s, and the relationship is likely to strengthen. Director Haynes, let me ask you, do you believe that's still the case? Was it more the case before this invasion? Has this changed that calculus? And do we believe that Beijing is looking at this as surprised, perhaps, as Putin was of the Western response?
Thank you, Representative. I think Director Coates was exactly right. I believe that it continues to be the case that they are getting closer together. We see that across a range of sectors, economic, political, security, and expect it to continue. I think there's a limit to which it will go, but nevertheless, that remains a concern. And in terms of the impact of the current crisis, I'd say that it's not yet clear to me exactly how it will affect the trajectory of their relationship. I think it's clear that China has not come out and criticized Russia for their actions, clearly, and yet at the same time, they did abstain, for example, in the context of the UN Security Council resolution and in other scenarios. And it does seem as if they are potentially paying a price for not criticizing Russia, and that may have an impact on how this trajectory moves forward. But I think, in general, I think it does continue to the two countries get closer together, and others may have thoughts.
All I would add, Congressman, is I think Director Coates was right, and I think, if anything, that relationship, the partnership between Russia and China has strengthened since 2019. I would add, though, that I think the President Xi and the Chinese leadership are a little bit unsettled by what they're seeing in Ukraine. They did not anticipate the significant difficulties the Russians were going to run into. I think they're unsettled by the reputational damage that can come by their close association with President Putin. Second, by the economic consequences at a moment when, they're facing lower annual growth rates than they've experienced for more than 3 decades. I think they're a little bit unsettled about the impact on the global economy. And third, I think they're a little bit unsettled by the way in which Vladimir Putin has driven Europeans and Americans much closer together. I think they've, valued their relationship with Europe and valued what they believe to be their capacity to try to drive wedges between us and the Europeans. And so I think that's unsettling for them as well.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll address this to anybody on the panel that wants to answer the question or to discuss this, but China is investing billions of dollars, we know, in its domestic semiconductor industry in an attempt to achieve full chip independence by 2050. I'm wondering what the assessment of the likelihood of China fully indigenizing its chip industry by then. What sort of security threats would you assess China's increased chip independence creates? And how can the U.S. and its allies address those threats moving forward?
So, Congressman, this is a very timely question, and as we look at China increasingly become more indigenous in their production, this has great concern for us. In terms of the broader impacts, I would like to talk about this a little bit more this afternoon because I can provide a depth I think that's very important for us to cover.
Okay, thank you. Do you perceive a threat that the Chinese-made chips could also be exported abroad, or is this a topic that you just would rather discuss in the closed setting?
If we can talk in closed setting, that'd be great.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me shift gears then, and we'll revisit that topic in the closed setting. General Barrier, some experts have voiced concerns that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could embolden the PRC to pursue a full-scale invasion or military blockade of Taiwan. What's your assessment of the likelihood of a copycat effect, and what more can the U.S. do to prevent the crisis in Ukraine from being repeated in Taiwan?
Congressman, I think Taiwan and Ukraine are two different things completely. I also believe that our deterrence posture in the Pacific puts a very different perspective on all of this. We do know that the PRC watching very, very carefully what happens and how this plays out throughout the entire dime, and I would address